Hook, in the grand halls of Ashworth Palace, where secrets are currency and whispers carry more weight than gold, young Prince Alexander's innocent question about his step-grandmother's mysterious child would unravel a truth so shocking that it threatened to bring down the very foundations of the monarchy itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ashworth Palace as Prince Alexander hurried through the corridors, his small footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. At only 8 years old, he possessed the curious nature that often got royal children into trouble. But today his curiosity burned brighter than ever. He had overheard something the night before, something that made his stomach twist with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or confusion, maybe both. Master Alexander called Mrs. Pemberton, the head governess, her voice stern as always. "You're late for your morning lessons." But Alexander barely heard her. His mind was consumed by the conversation he'd accidentally witnessed between his father, King Edmund, and Sir Reginald, the royal protector. They had been speaking in hushed tones about Queen Consort Vivian, his step-grandmother, and a child that shouldn't exist. Queen Vivian had married his grandfather when Alexander was just 5 years old, bringing grace and elegance to the palace that had been missing since his grandmother's passing. She was beautiful, kind, and had always treated Alexander with genuine warmth. But last night, he had learned something that shattered his perception of the woman he had grown to love. The palace seemed different now, as if the very walls held secrets that pressed down on him. Alexander made his way to the library, seeking solitude among the towering shelves of ancient books. It was there that he often found comfort, surrounded by stories of brave knights and distant kingdoms where things were simpler than the complex world he inhabited. "Your Highness," a gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. Alexander turned to find Thomas, one of the younger palace guards, standing in the doorway. Thomas had always been kind to him, often sharing stories of life outside the palace walls. "Thomas," Alexander said, his voice smaller than usual, "can I ask you something?" The guard stepped closer, concern evident in his eyes. "Of course, Your Highness. What's troubling you?" Alexander hesitated. The weight of what he had learned felt too heavy for his young shoulders to bear alone. "Do you know about Queen Vivian's other child?" Thomas's face went pale, and he quickly glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Your Highness, where did you hear about—" "I heard Father and Sir Reginald talking," Alexander interrupted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "They said she had a child before she married Grandfather, a child she kept secret. They said—" He swallowed hard. "They said the child might be dangerous to our family." Thomas knelt down to Alexander's level, his expression grave. "Young Prince, there are things in this palace that are better left undiscovered. Some secrets are buried for good reason." But Alexander's curiosity had been awakened, and, like all children, he couldn't simply let it go. "But why would Queen Vivian's child be dangerous? She's so kind and gentle." Thomas stood slowly, conflict evident in his features. He had served the royal family faithfully for years, but he also had a soft spot for the young prince who reminded him so much of himself at that age, curious, innocent, and hungry for truth. "Your Highness," Thomas began carefully, "what I'm about to tell you must remain between us. Do you understand?" Alexander nodded eagerly, though a part of him wondered if he truly wanted to know what Thomas was about to reveal. 23 years ago, before Queen Vivian became part of this family, she was involved with someone unsuitable, a man from the neighboring kingdom of Ravencrest, our historical enemy. When she discovered she was with child, her family arranged for the child to be raised in secret, far from court. Alexander's eyes widened. An enemy kingdom? This was far more serious than he had imagined. Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The child, now a grown woman named Lady Catherine, has recently discovered her true parentage. And, according to our intelligence, she's not content to remain hidden any longer." "What does she want?" Alexander asked, though he feared the answer. "Revenge," Thomas said simply. "She believes Queen Vivian abandoned her to protect her own reputation. She blames our family for the life of obscurity she was forced to live. And now, she's gathering support from those who would see our monarchy fall. The library felt suddenly cold, despite the warm sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Alexander pulled his jacket tighter around himself as the implications of what he'd learned began to sink in. But surely Father knows how to handle this, Alexander said, seeking reassurance. He's the king. He can protect us. Thomas's expression grew even more serious. Your father is indeed wise and strong, Your Highness. But Lady Catherine isn't just any threat. She is claimed to royal blood through Queen Vivian, and she's brilliant, educated in secret by some of the finest minds in Ravencrest. She knows our weaknesses, our protocols, our secrets. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. How does she know our secrets? Because, Thomas said, glancing once more toward the door, she's been here before. In disguise, as a member of the staff. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Someone with ill intent had been living among them, watching them, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. The palace, which had always felt like the safest place in the world, suddenly seemed full of shadows and hidden dangers. Who was she? Alexander asked, his voice barely audible. We're not entirely certain, Thomas admitted. She's a master of disguise, and she had help from the inside. But Sir Reginald believes she was here for several months last year, learning everything she could about her family's daily life. Alexander's mind raced, trying to remember any staff member who had seemed unusual or out of place. But the palace employed hundreds of people, and many faces blended together in his young mind. Why are you telling me this? Alexander asked suddenly, realizing that Thomas was sharing information that was probably meant for adults only. Thomas knelt down again, placing a gentle hand on Alexander's shoulder. Because, Your Highness, you're not just any child. You're a prince, and someday you may need to protect this family. But more than that, I can see that you're troubled by what you overheard. Sometimes knowing the truth, even when it's frightening, is better than living with fear of the unknown. Alexander nodded, appreciating Thomas's honesty even as it terrified him. What happens now? He asked. Now, Thomas said, standing and straightening his uniform. You must be brave. You must continue your lessons, continue being the prince this kingdom needs. But you must also be watchful. If you see anything unusual, anyone who doesn't seem to belong, you must tell Sir Reginald immediately. What about Queen Vivian? Alexander asked. Does she know her daughter has been here? Thomas's expression grew complicated. That, Your Highness, is one of the many questions your father and Sir Reginald are trying to answer. Queen Vivian claims she had no knowledge of Lady Catherine's infiltration. But you don't believe her, Alexander finished. Thomas didn't respond directly, but his silence was answer enough. As Alexander left the library that day, his world felt fundamentally changed. The palace corridors that had once seemed warm and familiar now felt full of potential threats. Every servant he passed made him wonder, could this be Lady Catherine in disguise? Every shadow seemed to hide a potential enemy. But perhaps most troubling of all was the growing doubt about Queen Vivian herself. The woman who had read him bedtime stories and comforted him when he missed his deceased grandmother might be harboring secrets that could destroy everything he held dear. That evening, as Alexander sat at the formal dining table with his family, he watched Queen Vivian carefully. She was as elegant and composed as always, making pleasant conversation with his father and asking about Alexander's studies. But now he noticed things he had never seen before. The way her eyes sometimes seemed distant, as if she were thinking of something far away. The way she occasionally glanced toward the windows, as if expecting someone. Alexander, dear, Queen Vivian said suddenly, startling him from his observations. You seem unusually quiet tonight. Is everything well? Alexander met her gaze, searching for any sign of deception or hidden knowledge. But all he saw was the same gentle concern that had always been there. I'm fine, Queen Vivian, he managed, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. She smiled, but Alexander thought he detected a flicker of something. Worry, perhaps? In her eyes before she turned back to her meal. As the family finished dinner and prepared to retire for the evening, Alexander found himself walking beside Queen Vivian toward the main staircase. "Alexander," she said softly, "if something were troubling you, you would tell me, wouldn't you? I know I'm not your blood grandmother, but I hope you know that I care for you, as if you were my own." The sincerity in her voice made Alexander's chest tighten. Either Queen Vivian was the most accomplished actress he had ever encountered, or she genuinely cared for him despite the dangerous secrets surrounding her past. "I know," he said simply, not trusting himself to say more. As they reached the top of the stairs, Queen Vivian paused and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The palace can be a lonely place for a child, full of adult concerns and complications. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter what you might hear or learn, my affection for you is real and unchanging. Her words sent a chill through Alexander. Did she know that he had discovered her secret? Was this her way of trying to ensure his silence? Or was she genuinely trying to comfort a child she sensed was troubled? "Thank you," he whispered, unsure what else to say. That night, Alexander lay in his ornate bed, staring at the painted ceiling of his chamber. Sleep seemed impossible with so many questions racing through his mind. Somewhere out there, a woman named Lady Catherine, Queen Vivian's secret daughter, was planning something that could threaten everything he knew and loved. And here, within the very walls of his home, lived the woman whose past had created this threat. A woman who claimed to love him, but whose every gentle word now seemed layered with hidden meaning. As the palace settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He would not simply wait for the adults to handle this crisis. He would uncover the truth himself, no matter how frightening it might be. Because if Lady Catherine was indeed planning to strike at his family, he needed to be ready. And if Queen Vivian was somehow involved in that plan, he needed to know before it was too late. The innocent child who had awakened that morning was gone forever, replaced by a young prince who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the crown came with burdens as well as privileges. And one of the heaviest burdens of all was the weight of secrets that could either protect or destroy those he loved. 3 weeks had passed since Alexander's conversation with Thomas, and the palace felt like a chessboard where every move carried the weight of potential disaster. Alexander had become a different child, quieter, more observant, always watching for signs that something was amiss. His new awareness had revealed details he had never noticed before. The way certain guards exchanged meaningful glances when they thought no one was looking. The increased security around Queen Vivian's private quarters. The mysterious late-night meetings his father held with Sir Reginald and other high-ranking officials. Most disturbing of all, Alexander had begun to notice that Queen Vivian herself seemed to be under subtle surveillance. Guards who claimed to be protecting her seemed more interested in watching her every move than protecting her from external threats. It was during his morning walk through the palace gardens that Alexander first saw her, a young woman with striking green eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a simple style. She wore the uniform of a kitchen maid, but something about her posture suggested she was accustomed to more refined circumstances. Their eyes met across the rose garden, and Alexander felt an immediate sense of unease. There was something familiar about her features, something that reminded him of Queen Vivian. The woman quickly looked away and hurried toward the servants' entrance, but not before Alexander caught a glimpse of a small scar above her left eyebrow, a detail that would become important later. That evening, Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on his studies. His tutor, Professor Morrison, grew increasingly frustrated with his distracted responses. "Your Highness," Professor Morrison said sternly, "mathematics requires attention to detail. You cannot rule a kingdom if you cannot master basic calculations." "Professor," Alexander said suddenly, "what do you know about infiltration tactics?" Professor Morrison blinked in surprise. I beg your pardon? If someone wanted to enter a palace in disguise, how would they do it? What would they study? How would they prepare? The elderly professor set down his papers, concern evident in his weathered features. Your Highness, this is a most unusual question. Why would you want to know about such things? Alexander realized he had revealed too much of his concerns, but he pressed on. It's for a story I'm writing, about knights and castles and spies. Professor Morrison studied him carefully. Very well. In theory, a successful infiltrator would need several things. A convincing background story, knowledge of palace protocols, the ability to mimic appropriate behavior for their assumed role, and, most importantly, inside help from someone already established within the target location. Inside help, Alexander repeated, his mind racing. Indeed, no matter how skilled an infiltrator might be, they would need someone on the inside to provide them with detailed information about schedules, security measures, and the personalities of key individuals they might encounter. Alexander felt a chill as the implications became clear. If Lady Catherine had indeed infiltrated the palace as Thomas suggested, she hadn't done it alone. Someone within their trusted circle had betrayed them. That night, Alexander made a decision that would have horrified his parents if they had known. Instead of going to sleep as usual, he waited until the palace grew quiet, then slipped out of his room to begin his own investigation. The palace at night was a different world entirely. Shadows danced in the moonlight, streaming through tall windows, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. Alexander moved carefully through the corridors, grateful for his small size that allowed him to hide easily behind pillars and tapestries. He made his way toward the servants' quarters, reasoning that if someone was hiding among the staff, that's where he would find evidence. The lower levels of the palace were unfamiliar territory for him, and he quickly became lost in the maze of corridors that housed the working areas of their home. It was while trying to find his way back that he stumbled upon a conversation that would change everything. Hidden behind a large tapestry depicting his ancestor King Harold's victory at the Battle of Westmere, Alexander found himself inadvertently eavesdropping on a heated discussion taking place in an adjacent room. The plan must be accelerated, a woman's voice said urgently. They're becoming suspicious. Sir Reginald has tripled security around the family quarters. Patience, replied a male voice that Alexander didn't recognize. We've waited this long. We can wait a little longer. No, the woman insisted, and Alexander's blood ran cold as he recognized something familiar in her tone. Every day we delay gives them more opportunity to discover the truth. The boy has already been asking questions. Alexander's heart nearly stopped. Were they talking about him? What boy? The man asked. Prince Alexander. I saw him watching me in the garden yesterday. He's too observant for a child his age. And if Thomas has been talking to him, Alexander pressed himself harder against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Thomas had been mentioned by name. Did that mean he was part of whatever plot was being discussed? Thomas won't be a problem much longer, the man said with a coldness that made Alexander shiver. Our friend has assured us of that. And Queen Vivian? There was a long pause before the man answered. She served her purpose. Once we have what we came for, her fate will be decided by those with more authority than us. Alexander heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor and realized the meeting was ending. Panic seized him as he tried to find a way to escape without being seen. But as he turned to flee, his foot caught on the edge of the tapestry, sending him tumbling to the ground with a soft thud. What was that? The woman's voice was sharp with alarm. Alexander heard footsteps moving toward his hiding place and knew he had seconds before he would be discovered. In desperation, he crawled under a nearby table just as the tapestry was pulled aside. I don't see anything, the man said, but his voice was closer now. Check the corridor, the woman ordered. Alexander held his breath as footsteps moved past his hiding place and into the hallway beyond. He waited what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before he dared to emerge from under the table. The room was empty now, but he could see evidence of the meeting that had taken place. 2 chairs positioned close together, and on the table above, where he had hidden, a piece of paper that had been left behind. With trembling hands, Alexander reached for the paper. It was covered in handwriting he didn't recognize, but the words he could make out sent ice through his veins. Phase 3. Elimination of primary threats. Target: Royal Protector. Method: poison in morning tea. Timeline: tomorrow, 7 a.m. Secondary targets to follow as planned. Alexander stared at the paper in horror. They were planning to poison Sir Reginald, the man responsible for protecting his entire family. And from a mention of secondary targets, it was clear that Sir Reginald was just the beginning. The paper also contained what appeared to be a crude map of the palace, with various rooms marked and numbered. His father's study was marked with a 1, Queen Vivian's chambers with a 2, and his own room with a 3. Alexander's hands shook as the full scope of the plot became clear. This wasn't just about revenge against Queen Vivian. This was a coordinated attack against his entire family, planned with intimate knowledge of the palace layout and their daily routines. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the realization that the voices he had heard belonged to people who had access to areas of the palace that should have been secure. This wasn't an outside threat. This was a betrayal from within their own walls. Alexander carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He needed to get back to his room without being seen, and then he needed to decide what to do with this information. The adults had their own investigation underway, but they clearly didn't know about the imminent threat to Sir Reginald's life. As he made his way through the dark corridors, Alexander's mind raced with possibilities. Should he wake his father immediately? Should he try to find Sir Reginald? Or should he attempt to prevent the poisoning himself? The weight of adult responsibilities had never felt heavier on his young shoulders. In a matter of hours, a man's life would be in danger, and Alexander might be the only person who could prevent it. But even as he climbed the stairs toward the family quarters, another realization was forming in his mind. The woman's voice in that room. The more he thought about it, the more familiar it became. Not because he had heard it before in conversation, but because it shared subtle inflections and tonal qualities with someone he knew well. Someone he had trusted completely until 3 weeks ago. As Alexander slipped back into his room and closed the door behind him, he was forced to confront a possibility that made him feel physically sick. The woman in that room, the one coordinating an attack against his family, had sounded remarkably similar to Queen Vivian. But that would mean that the woman who had comforted him through nightmares and celebrated his achievements was actively planning to destroy everything he loved. It would mean that her concern for his well-being and her expressions of affection had all been elaborate deceptions designed to keep him from suspecting her true nature. Alexander sat on the edge of his bed, the stolen paper burning like fire in his pocket, and tried to make sense of a world that had become unrecognizable. Tomorrow morning, Sir Reginald would drink his usual tea, unaware that it might be poisoned. Tomorrow, his family would go about their daily routines, unaware that they were being watched and planned against by people they trusted. And Alexander, an 8-year-old boy who should have been worried about nothing more serious than his mathematics lessons, would have to find the courage to expose a plot that could save lives or doom his family forever. The innocent trust of childhood had been completely shattered, replaced by a cold understanding that in the world of royalty, anyone could be an enemy wearing the mask of a friend. And sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who kissed you goodnight and promised to keep you safe. As dawn began to break over the palace towers, Alexander made his decision. He would not wait for the adults to solve this mystery. Too many lives hung in the balance, and time was running out. He would have to become not just a prince, but a protector of his family, even if it meant confronting truths that would change his world forever. Alexander's plan was simple but dangerous. He would intercept Sir Reginald's morning tea and replace it with a cup he prepared himself. The risk was enormous. If he was caught, he would face serious consequences for interfering with palace security protocols. But if he did nothing, a good man might die. At 6:30 in the morning, Alexander crept through the palace corridors toward the kitchen. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved through areas where he was rarely allowed, but his determination kept him focused. The kitchen was already bustling with activity as the staff prepared for the day's meals. Alexander had studied their routines carefully over the past weeks, and he knew that Sir Reginald's tea was always prepared by Mrs. Hartwell, the head cook, and delivered by young Emma, one of the kitchen maids. Alexander positioned himself behind a large cabinet where he could observe without being seen. Right on schedule, Mrs. Hartwell prepared a silver tray with an ornate teacup and saucer, carefully measuring tea leaves into a delicate porcelain pot. But, as Alexander watched, a figure approached Mrs. Hartwell from behind, the auburn-haired woman he had seen in the garden. She was dressed in kitchen staff attire, and she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Mrs. Hartwell," the woman said in a pleasant voice, "let me help you with that. You look tired this morning." "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Hartwell replied, stepping aside as the woman took over the tea preparation. "These old hands aren't what they used to be." Alexander watched in horror as the woman glanced around quickly, then produced a small vial from her apron pocket. With practiced efficiency, she emptied the vial's contents into the steaming teapot, stirring it gently to ensure it dissolved completely. The poisoning was happening exactly as the plan had indicated, and Alexander was watching it unfold in real time. His mouth went dry as he realized he was witnessing an attempted murder. The woman, who could only be Lady Catherine in disguise, completed her work and handed the tray to Emma. "Please make sure Sir Reginald receives this promptly," she said with a smile that looked perfectly innocent but filled Alexander with dread. Emma nodded and headed toward the door that led to the upper floors. Alexander knew he had only minutes before Sir Reginald would drink the poisoned tea. Moving faster than he ever had in his life, Alexander intercepted Emma in the corridor just outside the kitchen. "Emma," he called out, trying to sound casual despite his racing heart. "I need to speak with Sir Reginald. May I carry the tray for you?" Emma looked surprised but pleased. "Of course, Your Highness. How thoughtful of you." Alexander took the tray with hands that he hoped weren't visibly shaking. "Thank you. You can return to your other duties." As soon as Emma disappeared back into the kitchen, Alexander found the nearest washroom and poured the poisoned tea down the drain. He rinsed the teapot thoroughly, then refilled it with water from the tap. It wouldn't taste like proper tea, but it wouldn't kill Sir Reginald either. When Alexander arrived at Sir Reginald's office, he found the royal protector reviewing documents at his desk. The older man looked up with surprise at the unexpected visit. "Your Highness," Sir Reginald said, rising from his chair. "This is most unusual. What brings you here so early?" Alexander set the tray down on the desk, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't reveal his true knowledge of the situation. "I wanted to thank you for protecting our family, Sir Reginald. I thought bringing you your morning tea myself might be a nice gesture." Sir Reginald's stern expression softened slightly. "That's very thoughtful, young prince. Though I must say, you seem rather pale this morning. Are you feeling well?" Before Alexander could answer, the office door burst open and Thomas rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir Reginald," Thomas said breathlessly, "we have a problem. I've just discovered that." He stopped short when he saw Alexander. "Your Highness, you shouldn't be here." "What's wrong, Thomas?" Sir Reginald demanded. Thomas glanced uncertainly between Alexander and his superior. "Sir, we've uncovered evidence of a plot against the royal family. The threat is immediate." Sir Reginald reached for his teacup, and Alexander's heart nearly stopped. Even though he had replaced the poison with water, he suddenly realized that his interference might have created suspicion. "Wait," Alexander said quickly. "The tea. It's not very hot anymore. Shall I have Emma bring you a fresh pot?" Sir Reginald paused, studying Alexander's face with the sharp attention that had made him such an effective protector. "Your Highness, is there something you need to tell me?" Alexander felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. All his careful planning had led to this instant where he would have to trust Sir Reginald with the truth or watch his family remain in danger. "Yes," Alexander said quietly. "There's something I need to show you." He reached into his jacket pocket and, withdrew the folded paper he had taken from the meeting room. With trembling hands, he gave it to Sir Reginald. As the royal protector read the document, his face grew increasingly grave. "Where did you get this?" he asked sharply. Alexander took a deep breath and told them everything. His conversation with Thomas, the woman he had seen in the garden, the overheard meeting, and the plot to poison Sir Reginald's morning tea. When he finished, both men stared at him in stunned silence. "Your Highness," Sir Reginald said finally, "you may have just saved my life. But, more importantly, you've provided us with crucial intelligence about the scope of this conspiracy." Thomas stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Sir, there's more. We've discovered the identity of the infiltrator. Her name is Lady Catherine Blackwood, and she's Queen Vivian's daughter." "I know," Alexander said quietly. "I figured that out too." Sir Reginald set down the paper and looked directly at Alexander. "Young Prince, what you've done today shows remarkable courage and intelligence. But I need to ask you something very important, and I need you to answer me honestly." Alexander nodded, preparing himself for whatever question was coming. "Do you believe Queen Vivian is involved in this plot against your family?" It was the question Alexander had been dreading, but also the one he knew he had to face. He thought about all his interactions with Queen Vivian over the past weeks, analyzing every conversation and gesture for signs of deception. "I don't know," he said finally. "The voice I heard in that room sounded like it could have been hers, but I can't be certain. And she's always been kind to me. But, Sir Reginald prompted. "But she's been acting differently lately, more distant. And she asks me strange questions sometimes, like she's trying to find out how much I know about things." Thomas and Sir Reginald exchanged meaningful looks. "Sir," Thomas said carefully, "we have evidence that Queen Vivian has been in contact with someone outside the palace. Secret correspondence that our monitoring systems detected." Alexander felt his heart sink. Despite his growing suspicions, a part of him had hoped that Queen Vivian was innocent, that the woman who had shown him such kindness couldn't be capable of such betrayal. "What kind of correspondence?" Alexander asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sir Reginald hesitated before responding. "Letters to Lady Catherine. We intercepted several messages over the past month. They appear to contain detailed information about your family's daily routines, security protocols, and even personal conversations." The room seemed to spin around Alexander as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Queen Vivian hadn't just known about her daughter's infiltration of the palace. She had been actively helping her. "So she's been lying to us all along," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We believe so," Sir Reginald confirmed gently. "But we needed proof before we could act. Your courage in uncovering this plot has provided us with the evidence we needed." Alexander felt a mixture of relief and devastating sadness. Relief that the threat to his family could now be properly addressed, but sadness at the loss of someone he had grown to love and trust. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Sir Reginald said, "we need to move quickly and carefully. Lady Catherine is still somewhere in the palace, and we need to apprehend her before she can carry out the rest of her plan. As for Queen Vivian, she'll have to face the consequences of her choices," Thomas finished quietly. Alexander nodded, understanding that the woman who had read him bedtime stories and comforted him when he was sad would soon be arrested for treason. The thought made him feel sick, but he knew it was necessary to protect his family. "There's something else," Sir Reginald said. "We've discovered that this plot extends beyond just Lady Catherine and Queen Vivian. There are others involved, members of the nobility who see opportunity in chaos, and foreign agents who want to destabilize our kingdom." "How many others?" Alexander asked, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. "We're still investigating, but it appears to be a coordinated effort involving at least a dozen conspirators. Your family wasn't just facing a personal vendetta, you were targets in a much larger political scheme." The magnitude of what Alexander had helped uncover was staggering. What had started as his curiosity about an overheard conversation had led to the discovery of a plot that threatened not just his family, but the stability of the entire kingdom. Over the following days, the palace became a whirlwind of activity as Sir Reginald and his security forces worked to round up the conspirators. Lady Catherine was found hiding in the servants' quarters and arrested without incident. Queen Vivian was taken into custody as she prepared for what she claimed was a routine morning walk in the gardens. The foreign agents mentioned in the intercepted correspondence were expelled from the kingdom, and several nobles who had been providing support to the conspiracy found themselves facing charges of treason. Throughout it all, Alexander struggled with complex emotions. Relief that his family was safe was tempered by grief for the loss of Queen Vivian's presence in his life. Even knowing that her affection had been false, he couldn't simply erase the comfort she had provided during their time together. His father, King Edmund, took time to speak with Alexander privately about everything that had happened. "I want you to know how proud I am of your courage," the king said as they walked together through the palace gardens. "But I also want to make sure you understand that what you experienced, this betrayal by someone you trusted, is not a reflection of your judgment or your worth." "I should have seen the signs earlier," Alexander said, still grappling with self-doubt. "Son," the king replied gently, "even adults with years of experience in statecraft were deceived by Queen Vivian. She was a skilled manipulator who spent years perfecting her performance. The fact that you eventually saw through her deception shows wisdom beyond your years." Alexander kicked at a small stone on the garden path. "Will you marry again?" The king was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Someday, perhaps. But when I do, it will be to someone whose background has been thoroughly investigated, whose motivations are clear, and whose loyalty to this family is absolute. The safety of my son will never again be compromised by matters of the heart." As they continued their walk, Alexander felt the burden of recent events beginning to lift slightly from his shoulders. The palace was still his home. His father was still the strong and caring man he had always been, and the future, while uncertain, no longer held the immediate threat that had haunted them for weeks. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander had learned that he possessed courage and intelligence that could make a real difference when the people he loved were in danger. The frightened child who had first overheard whispers of conspiracy was gone, replaced by a young prince who understood both the privileges and the responsibilities that came with his position. That evening, as Alexander prepared for bed in his chamber, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning weeks ago when he had first learned of Queen Vivian's secret. The palace felt different now, more secure, but also more serious. The innocent trust of childhood had been replaced by a more mature understanding of the complex world he inhabited. Thomas appeared at his door to bid him good night, as had become their custom since the crisis began. "How are you feeling, Your Highness?" Thomas asked gently. "Different," Alexander replied honestly. "Sadder, but also stronger, I think." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's the mark of wisdom, young prince. The ability to learn from difficult experiences and emerge stronger for having faced them." As Alexander settled into his bed that night, he felt a sense of peace that had been absent for weeks. The immediate danger was over, the conspirators were in custody, and his family was safe. But more than that, he had discovered something important about himself, that when faced with a crisis, he could rise to meet it. The future would undoubtedly bring new challenges and new threats. That was the nature of royal life, and Alexander now understood that reality in a way he never had before. But he also knew that he had the courage, intelligence, and determination to face whatever came next. And as sleep finally claimed him, Alexander's last thought was a recognition that while the events of recent weeks had cost him his innocence, they had given him something equally valuable in return: the knowledge that he had what it took to protect the people and the kingdom he would someday rule.